We are gathered here today at a pivotal moment in this decarbonization journey, where trade, technology, and geopolitics are converging to fundamentally impact our next 10 years. How will Europe balance industrial competitiveness with climate action? What are the impacts of US decision-making? And of course, where does China engage in this reality? These decisions don't affect only global realities and economies, but communities, individuals, livelihoods, and identity. To help us unpack this, I'm very happy to welcome on stage Daria Ivleva, Senior Advisor and Co-Lead for Climate Policy at Adelphi, Karen Backstrom, Professor of Political Science at Stockholm University, and Andre Momberger, Senior Lecturer at Lund University. And Andre is going to start us off by setting the stage for today's discussion.
Thank you. So, thank you. I will talk about the geopolitics of decarbonization, and I will focus on three areas that we've covered partly today already. Firstly, security. Secondly, economy, and thirdly, sustainability. And although these can be seen as different themes, I think we can also see that they are becoming ever more interdependent. Now, decarbonization changes demand for natural resources. Demand for the fossil fuels is declining, of course, but the demand for the materials used to produce green technologies are increasing. And it's evident that many of the major fossil fuel producers see this as a threat to their resource rents and stranded assets. However, I think that focusing only on the extraction side really do not account for the scale of these issues. These supply chains are embedded in societies and the trade networks. And a case in point is the vehicle industry. At a first glance, replacing the internal combustion engines with electric ones might seem as a minor change. But it has proven that it's rather difficult to start up these new supply chains with battery manufacturing and so on. 10 years from now, the EU plans to sell the last car with having an internal combustion engine on the market. So these changes are extremely rapid going forward. Today, the automotive sector represents one of the biggest sectors within the European Union, with more than 6% of the labor force. But the batteries, the rare earths, the metals used to produce these electric vehicles are today mainly imported from other countries, particularly China. And this brings me to my second point on security, that although decarbonization is often seen as having a co-benefit with reduced use of fossil fuels, there is also a flip side to this coin with increased dependence on critical raw materials. Solar PVs and batteries being produced in other countries that we import. And the EU has over the last few years formulated more and more policies to mitigate these import dependencies. For example, to increase the extraction of materials within its own borders, to diversify imports, and to recycle more of the materials. And to an increased extent, the EU is also connecting these policies with its industrial policies, trying to build new value chains. One example is the Battery Alliance, where the Commission is trying to orchestrate, together with the industry, the development of entire new value chains. And the Draghi report we heard about in the morning, I think, signals that more can be expected to come in this policy direction. And this would probably have been unthinkable just a few years ago, when the EU had a very different approach to some of these policy making. Nowadays, trade is sometimes seen as negative, a zero-sum game, and the EU has introduced new vocabularies such as strategic autonomy into its dictionary. But this is very much a balancing act for the Union and the values it wants to protect and defend. So, geopolitics do impact sustainability and vice versa. And although there are fears that the rise of the security narrative on the policy agenda might make the decarbonization drop, I think that the EU has shown over the last couple of years that even in these turbulent times, it's determined to stick to the sustainability agenda when it comes to its decarbonization targets. At least for now, although some of the policies might be renegotiated over time. But responses to trade wars and national security will probably result in a reshoring of some of the extraction and manufacturing. And this also means that we will have a reshoring of the environmental impacts from our products' production. One example that I will give you is the extraction of battery metals, and namely lithium. The lithium is required in order to produce these batteries, and currently you do not have any lithium mine that mines these lithium for the batteries. But the European mining industry has planned to open somewhere between 10 to 50 new lithium mines in Europe within the next few years. The vast majority of these projects are disputed by the local communities, mainly on sustainability grounds and its impact. And if there is something positive to bring from this, then I think that these trade wars and so on might make us more aware of this environmental impact. The fossil fuel extraction is not really that good, but by having this more closer to us, we see it. It becomes in our own front yard, so to say. And perhaps that open up for more dialogues, discussion on how we use resources, and also a more efficient way of using resources and a more sustainable way of extracting them. So I end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think a lot of those topics will get picked up during the course of today's conversation. But I wanted to start actually with Daria, because when we spoke a few weeks ago, you said something I wanted everyone to hear to set the stage, that we should all admit that we are developing countries when it comes to the new energy transition. I want you to unpack that for us, but I want you to do it with the lens of Sweden and Nigeria. Two very different countries, both Paris Agreement signers, but very different energy mixes.
Okay. I know nothing about Sweden, to be honest. No, thanks so much for this question. And I think so maybe just as a bit of a background, if I may, really briefly, so people know what we've been doing in this illustrious round and working on geopolitics of decarbonization within the Mistra Geopolitics consortium. So back in the first phase, we started looking at, as you said, like how geopolitics impacts decarbonization and vice versa. And there was this graph with lots of arrows. I think Björn-Ola may remember. So we were all about saying, okay, these two topics are connected. So decarbonization is not sort of opposition to geopolitics. Either you have like the geopolitical world or you have like a bright green future. It's very intimately connected, and on the way from A to B during this transition, it's going to be geopolitical in any case. And that was our argument. And we did, some regional case studies with the Belt and Road Initiative, some policy area studies with trade in our paper, and tried to make it very visible and very specific. Then came the second phase, and the world changed, as we know, and I felt a bit obsolete. I was like, okay, I don't need to explain to people that it's geopolitical because everybody sees it. It's very obvious. And
just tell us how the world changed.
In one sentence.
In one sentence.
Wow. I mean, obviously, what I'm referring to specifically was the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the energy implications that came with it. I think that was very visible in Europe. So I think a lot of also of economic visions of how countries were thinking they would develop in the future just broke down with this, at least for a while. And we came together in this thinking about it in the very early stages, thinking about it. I think Dan Smith gave a keynote during that annual conference speaking about what this means. I think it was maybe February, so it was very early in the days, and we were looking and thinking like, what can we contribute? What can we say about this? But I think this is too much reminiscing. So going back to like what we did in the second phase, we looked, I think, from this recognition that decarbonization is not only geopolitical, but it's just a whole of a society task, and that we all face extreme challenges moving to it as a society, also like discursively in our minds and imagining, you know, I think Bjorn had this picture with this gray half and then the green half. So the green half, we kind of see it, but we don't really we don't really believe it maybe as a society that we can make it and that, you know, we can prosper there. So we looked more into this, and then it comes to looking at Colombia and Nigeria, where we analyze specifically the narratives that elites use, mostly elites use, to reconcile the fact that they subscribe to the Paris Agreement, but on the other hand continue the exploration and building the economies on raw material exports, and also using them, so oil and gas specifically, for national economies specifically. And now I can finally answer your question. Please, sorry about that, but it's also an overview of what we've been doing. In that sense, we found out that you don't have to be a fossil fuel dependent exporter to really stick to these visions and discourses of, we know that we need to change the system, but actually the system is kind of fine. We need to adjust here, and then technology there, and then we kind of will manage this, I think, possibly. And in this sense, I think we're all developing countries, because we all need to develop, be it Germany, I can speak more to Germany and to Sweden. We faced very similar difficulties believing in this other future, and that could be this different economy, and but it's also based on the fact that there's not enough political work in creating and supporting these narratives, which is then instrumentalized by people or interests who sort of use the fact that we don't really believe it to obscure through the narratives how the current model of development is not sustainable. And I think this is something we found out through the study also of Nigeria and Colombia.
When we spoke, I think what was interesting, and that I'm going to come back to it, the next question to you, Andre, is that you talked about the need for honesty and the need for transparency amongst countries, amongst cooperation, amongst collaboration. We're not going to make this final target unless we're honest with where we are today. I want to come to Andre, because you've talked about critical raw materials, which will be a part of this conversation, is a central part of this conversation. If you read Andre's papers, you know cobalt from the Congo, copper is from Chile, nickel from Indonesia, and of course now with the rising discussions on hydrogen, platinum is in South Africa. And you have this new transition of flows. You have huge resource demand, and you have resource scarcity. We have the Draghi report that you've touched upon, which has specific mention of how they will take care of critical raw materials, unsurprisingly to secure EU supply, of course. So I'm going to ask you, Andre, in this decarbonization dilemma, opportunities and challenges, where is the level playing field?
Yeah, so I think that some of the things that we, I mean, often when you see these like dependencies and so on, you're looking quite a lot on a rather static picture, how it looks here and now. And we have these where there are the countries that you mentioned, where the different resources are extracted. A lot of the next part of the supply chain is not in these countries. It's instead imported mainly to China, who is refining these materials and often also producing the technologies, or part of the technologies at least, I should say. Sometimes this is, what should I say, it's formulated quite a lot as a security problem where China has like tried to dominate this entire supply chain. But I think we should also be a bit humble and reflect upon why we have this situation. And I think that was really good with what Nick said on, like, China has really bettered their economy on this low carbon transition. China is the one who has been scaling up this extraction and paying for it, both when it comes to subsidies, public funding, so to say, and also when it comes to private investors and their companies. If they wouldn't have done this, then no one else would. Simply, the Western companies 10, 15 years ago didn't invest in this. right now, EU and Western companies are pretty much playing a catch-up game, trying to invest in this. And that's quite difficult. But if you look on how the investment flows are going, then more and more of this extraction will actually be by Western companies in the next few years to come. So I think that it's like a really static picture to look on it just from that. What I see as a problem here with the type of regulation that we have coming from, partly from EU with the Critical Raw Material Act, is that we have goals of having as much as possible of the supply chains within our own borders. And that basically means that we will be sourcing these materials as an unrefined concentrate, the mineral, which has a low economic value added. And then we will have the refining stages and so on, which is more high value added goods within our own borders. And this is one of the clashes that I see when it comes to sustainable development for these local communities. Often we only talk about the negative impacts from the mining of the local communities, mainly on the physical impacts at the site. And it's true that you can't have mining without any impact on the physical landscape. But there are also positive impacts when it comes to that. You have economic opportunities, jobs, and so on. And if you go back and looking on how Sweden has developed historically, then mining was one of the areas where it started, then enabling other sectors to grow. And if we say that these developing countries are not going to have the next step, then I think we are reinforcing the poverty trap of them. So that's like one of the key challenges of making a more level playing field.
And you mentioned that, of course, in your opening remarks about how you have Sweden looking at lithium mines now within Europe as well. And so I want to ask you a follow-up question on this reshoring. We're taking the value chain and bringing it within national borders to be more competitive. And as a result, we're doing this with a reliance on these developing countries that are resource extractors. So when it comes to reshoring, do you see this being a long-term new normal to protect and secure supply and demand?
Both yes and no. I think if we go back and looking on how commodity markets has developed, then commodity markets never follow the textbook example, Economy 101. So Economy 101, everything is in equilibrium, perfect supply demand. That is not how commodity markets work. Commodity markets are the complete opposite. They're always more or less either in a scarcity or where you have high prices, or you have the opposite situation with oversupply instead. And they are constantly shifting every decade or so between one end of the spectrum to the other. And the pendulum has been in full swing, I would say, where we have this scarcity situation. If we would go back to the early 1980s, we had a similar situation back then with the scarcity framing. And also with policies similar to the ones that are being implemented today, because it was seen as really urgent. Backing off from the liberal economic policies and instead having more state intervention. This shifted then, if we go to the late 1980s, early 1990s, to become more deregulated with oversupply, low commodity prices, and so on. And I would expect that in 10 years from now, we will have a very different situation than what we have today.
I want to ask you a follow-up question, but I'm going to come to Karin because, of course, what Daria and Andrea are saying is societal transformation. It starts with trade and geopolitics, but we're talking about societal transformation, disruption, and, of course, dissent. Now, I want to come to Sweden and to talk about, of course, we're all waiting to see the next few days what the EU puts out in terms of competitiveness, but we are seeing changes already at home. And I want to ask you, Karin, are we today in a net zero crisis?
I think net zero crisis, yes, in terms of that we have enormous difficulties to comply with and have comply with the Paris goal and have a massive emission gap. But I would say that the net zero crisis in Sweden, in EU globally, is symptomatic of a political crisis. And I don't say that only because I'm a political scientist, but as Nick also talked about is many of the problems we see of implementing the implementation gap with regard to Paris, with regard to the SDGs, we have 5 more years to go. A lot of the implementation deficit has to do with politics and political leadership. And I would say there are three issues. You're probably so tired of hearing it, but it needs to be emphasized. First, authoritarian populism. That we see this rise, and it coming from the domestic politics. So I think the domestic politics is extremely important to understand the global geopolitics. So it's authoritarian populism on the rise. We thought it had peaked. It's all back, Trump too, and in many countries. Secondly, it's democratic backsliding. What political scientists call democratic backsliding, recession, that we see a decline of democracy and democratic qualities all over the world, with less than 50% of the world states being democracies. And thirdly, also a political challenge, nationalism, the attack on the multilateral liberal world order. These three, of course, affect and amplify the net zero crisis and the challenges to transform. And I have no doubt, because historically, countries, the world, historically, societies have transformed, often during revolution and war. We don't want that. But we've gone from agricultural to industrial to post-industrial societies. I have no doubt that with human ingenuity, societies can decarbonize, deep, full decarbonization. But the challenge, and which Mistra Geopolitics illustrate, the dilemmas, I think this is a very good title, to do this in an age of intersecting multiple crises, COVID, energy security, war, nature, climate crisis, this kind of interlinked polycrisis. And then combined with this, these political challenges. So I hope to come back to some ways to move forward, but the net zero crisis is symptomatic of this larger political crisis. And I think ultimately it's about reform, changing in the electoral system nationally. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in countries such as Germany, France, where right-wing and authoritarian political parties are on the rise, because that will be very decisive for the global, hopefully green race to renewables.
So I'm going to try and take that, and Daria, I'm coming to you next. We're talking polycrisis. And we're talking about, of course, a change in governmental reform in terms of countries, in terms of what they're looking for, what they have an appetite to handle. Now, when it comes to the polycrisis, we've come out of this. We've actually survived crisis after crisis. We're actually able to move forward. But is that due to, Daria, leadership, signs, institutional frameworks that create mechanisms by which we learn to collaborate? Of course, the rule of law becomes very important in this discussion, and of course, understanding definitions on the same page. So I want to ask you, from a trade perspective, like you say, Mistra Geopolitics has been looking into the trade of decarbonization. What do we need to keep in mind in creating frameworks of engagement as we go forward through this very, very bumpy road ahead that Karin has pointed out?
Well, what do we need to keep in mind? I think that Andre put it quite by pointing to strategic autonomy. That's exactly the dilemma, or the task that we're like squaring this circle of being more resilient, more just, greener, and also kind of looking out for our own interests. So, you know, that's much. I think in our paper we wrote that's a lot to put on the EU trade as a policy. So it's all true, I suppose, and I think it's well, that's a personal opinion. We would maybe benefit from being more transparent about the interests, because sometimes it feels like the EU is sort of saying it's all about equity, building up value chains somewhere else, you know, also profiting, like partners profiting from this. And we're sort of all looking out for our own interests, but that's, you know, but I think that's, it's not a plausible narrative sometimes, or it's not a plausible way of communication, but that is something, you know, I did not do profound research on, so I will refrain from, you know, It's a personal opinion, let's say. But, on the transparency point, and maybe I just could come back. I'm really glad that you spoke about these 3 challenges, because it's something I wrote down as well while preparing. I think part of why the sustainable transformation is such a preferred target for populism is because we have not been honest and transparent about the challenges that come in. I think the narratives largely have been, were composed of 2 parts. One is the system is basically fine, mostly. We need some tweaks. And the second one is the transformation will not be, you will barely notice it, like we'll change again, we'll change some technologies and so on, but we'll deal with this. And both of these things turned out to not be true. And I mean, the system was not fine, and it's not fine because of, massive inequalities, massive conflicts that are already underlying.
If I can interrupt, Dara, what was the lens, at what point did we realize the system was flawed? What caused that recognition when we thought, actually, you know what, something is not right here?
I think we also need to talk about the we. I think we realize that, but the broad public debate. Yeah, I think the realization is still outstanding, but I think what we saw as a society is that the system was not resilient, for sure. Like, it was not resilient enough. We saw it during the pandemic and multiple wars, armed conflict that got worse. So you saw that the system was not actually as resilient, and we knew a lot of this. And the reaction, but because we said the system was great and the transformation will be barely noticeable, that gave the field to populists and other forces to say, okay, so clearly the system was fine way before, so let's go back to that point way earlier in time when we were okay. And it became even more difficult to argue to say, no, the transformation towards resilience and towards greener future is what will actually make it work. So I think that what we need in terms of honesty is to say, okay, so these and these are the problems with the system in terms of inter-society inequalities, in terms of like how we distribute power, where is the power lying for AI, for so on and so forth, right? All the topics that we discussed, and the inequalities internationally. And we also need to recognize things will need to change substantially, but we see it, and there will be conflict, and we have these instruments as democracies to deal with this. So for politics, if I may, just like what we need to do are 2 things. First is make it so. So do the policies, do technology transfer, do protect vulnerable groups, and so on and so forth, but also make it believable. So look at the narratives, because it's not about putting money in people's pockets is not per se helping. Also need to build like the I said narrative 1,000 times, but you also need to make it visible, and it's not just about like somewhat better communication. No, you really need to build a good story of this future and recognize also the loss that people have with, and Eva would have elaborated on that while they are moving from A to B. But yeah.
I mean, I'm going to say walk the talk. Actually have that honesty to say we will do what we say we do. And Karin,
but also talk the talk, like that. Both of them are very important, because if you just walk the talk and you don't really talk it,
and say.
It is also will be lost, because we are not looking at science as society, as we all know.
And there's an intangibility to this. And Karin, I want to come to you with that, because of course you've written a book that is hot off the press, December 2024, looking at the politics and governance of decarbonization, looking at Sweden and the different layers of governance, how to actually actuate change. And I'd like to hear from you, of course, when you have done the work on that book and looking at where we are. There have been winds of change even here in terms of Sweden being a leader in the decarbonization debate very much, but that has been met with a little less confidence today than it has maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah.
What does the road ahead look like? And of course, what are you seeing from the research?
And thanks for that question. I should say I'm a stand-in for Eva Löfbrand, who was going to be here today, and it's a collaborative book, and she wrote a fantastic, beautiful chapter in the book on just transition and perception of distributional justice and in Lysekil and the challenges and dilemmas of decarbonization. Anyway, the book, which is multi-author, hot off the presses, nice to market, is about the politics of large-scale decarbonization in Sweden. And we actually wrote the book at this juncture. It finished right before we see these changes in government. But if I go on the positives ahead, the book advances the concept of collaborative climate governance, that in order to achieve this unforeseen large-scale decarbonization, the state and non-state actors, sub-state actors have to collaborate, there is no way, for long we thought that business and communities, municipalities could do the work. We believed in carbon markets. There was also hope that the state only can bring this change, but it really looks at the interaction. And something in Sweden we are very good. We are a very consensual, cooperativistic society with close state-industry collaboration and known for a pragmatic way. And that's on the positives. But again, coming back to the challenges and the issues I brought up on populism and anti-net zero populism, that's a new concept where backtracking on goals. We have definitely seen, and we see in the book, and Sweden is part of that trend we see this backlash. And I would say there are 3 levels we can see it. And in the book, we see it with Sweden, some still consider Sweden as the leader. Yes, we rank very high on all climate policy index, but it is a bit of a bump. But there are 3 levels. Climate policy delay, a way where we actually, governments, including Sweden, delay goals, and usually using that the people, it's going too fast to enhance legitimacy. The second one is actually more of climate rollback, backtracking on goals, actually decreasing ambition. The third is climate policy dismantling. That's many researchers looking at, that we actually take away legislation. We've seen example of this in Sweden and also in other countries. We see it on the EU level and the Green Deal, and maybe we can come back to that. So in sum, what's the way ahead? I think Sweden should really take we've had a lot of credibility with our leadership position, and we are very, in a way, best in class in large-scale industrial decarbonization with fossil-free steel. So I do hope that this is a temporary, just a temporary bump in the road. But given the US election and the trends in general, also in Europe, I'm a bit pessimistic that we actually might see more of climate policy dismantling ahead.
So I actually now want to move away from this because I want to bring in an actor that we have not talked about. Yeah. And in the decarbonization story is a critical player, and that's private finance. And specifically private equity. These are big players in the discussion when it comes to, of course, green steel, when it comes to how do you incentivize this new energy transition. And these are players that do not play by the same rules. And the question is, Andre, I want to come to you. Where do you see private sector capital in this discussion? Because, of course, you mentioned commodity markets. You mentioned, of course, supply and demand. How do these private players engage in this new energy transition? And are they playing by the same rules?
I mean, I think when it coming back to these the commodities, that's one really clear where the private money are looking into. But we will also need to recognize that here in Europe, we haven't been mining a lot of these metals ourselves. Basically, we have been extracting so-called base metals, mainly here in Sweden with iron, copper, and so on. But for a lot of these others that are often known as critical raw materials, we don't have the knowledge base here. And we rely on other countries' expertise, mainly people coming from Canada and Australia. Who are the ones, and that's also where you can see that there is the money going to this, whether you have the capital markets and so on, with the risk, taking the risk for it. But there is also now, I think, a big turbulence in the commodity markets with some of these critical ones, where the big traditional mining companies are starting to buy up and purchase the junior ones in order to scale up the supply chains. So that's, but it is difficult also because you don't really know how big the supply or the demand will be in the future. It's really uncertain, and for a lot of these critical raw materials, you don't really mine them just for the sake of that certain material. You mine them as a byproduct of something else. And you need to have an additional investment in order to make that, in order to be able to recover those byproducts. And the risk of doing that can be really high. And that's difficult if you have a market-based economy like Europe. Who is going to take the risk of this, of investing and putting the money into scaling up these new supply chains when you don't know if there will be a demand or not in the future?
I'm going to ask you a question. I want to come to Karin and Daria. So do you think, because of course the capital markets become a critical element of this discussion, that we need to actually rely on capital markets to actually develop the supply chain and also de-risk these investments? Does Europe have a healthy functioning capital market?
So I don't think I'm the best one to answer on the capital market.
But is there the money that is needed to make this shift?
When it comes to the metals, then it's actually not that much money compared to the next step of the supply chain.
The manufacturing.
So yeah, exactly. So often you can see this as looking at a bit of a pyramid, an inverted pyramid. The materials are a very small part of the tip of it. And if we only look on the material value, then it's actually extremely small. As you grow up or start to move downstream in the supply chain, that's where the big money and value creation comes in. And this is also where it has been difficult in Europe to finding some of these investment and orchestra. And I think that the Commission is trying to do a lot of this when it comes to the Battery Alliance, but it's not really keeping up with the spending. And some of it, if we look on, for example, with Northvolt and so on, is that you're doing quite scaling up current technologies. You're not really trying to leapfrog in order to be what will be like the next generation of these technologies. And that is what I think looks very different if you would compare to what is happening in China, for example.
And this next technology, of course, that's where the risking becomes really critical, because you have to get the money in to take this risk, to take the next step. And then that leads me, both Karin and Daria, before we open up to the audience, I want to ask you about the institutions that we currently have, and are they fit for purpose to handle this new sort of stakeholder map? And of course, that brings in the non-state players, that brings in private finance, that brings in very clear agendas in terms of what they want to achieve, which is not the greater good, which is not necessarily the Paris Agreement. What are the institutions they are aligned to? And is the G20, the WTO, are these still institutions that should be made responsible to have these conversations? Daria, I want to start with you, and Karin, I want to give you the last word before we open to the audience.
I like the idea of not having the plan, but the planning. So just to cite the previous panel. So I think my vote would be not to wonder whether we have the institutions, but to try and work with the institutions that we have. And see, take the first, start going to this. I think we had this idea of like gradual change in using what we have in sort of a political entrepreneurial way, and try to figure out, okay, what's going to be the best impact instead of like setting the standard and not reaching it. So I think this would be my approach also in looking at these different stakeholders, even though I think there is bringing the big capital, whatever. I've heard tech bros. I don't know if there is a word for venture capital as well. Do we call venture capitalists something? Not sure, but part of it, I think, there are things to do. Other parts, I'm just wondering if the change that we need is actually scaling down some of the of these mechanisms. But maybe I'll just pass to Karin at this critical point.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, we have those are the institutions we have, whether it's WTO, multilateral or club models. And just to say, it's about political feasibility, because transform the multilateral system is very hard. Actually, in research, for 20 years we have discussed, that researchers has proposed in IR and political science, the World Environmental Organization matching the WTO. It's never happened. So I think it's better to use, and we should remember, these institutions were set up after the Second World War to take on these challenges. But in general with funding, I think the scale of transformation, both for SDGs and climate change, we have 5 more years to go. What is utmost importance is the mobilization of public and private funding, matching up. I have last year a research problem on research project on public-private partnerships for sustainable development. And it shows that those most successful partnerships are those where states and governments commit, the private sector, they can lead to transformation. But so we need more. I mean, the Green Deal in Europe, I think a fantastic idea, and I'm still surprised that EU kept on to the Green Deal during the COVID, because I expected, it's nice when your worst expectations are not fulfilled. EU kept to that. The Inflation Reduction Act, we need a kind of new generation of green industrialized policies where the state and the private sector join forces.
Great. With that, I'm going to open the audience. We have time for 2 questions. Do we have any questions to our panelists? We have one in the back over there. And second one right here in the front.
Hi, this is Ranjan Datta again from Calgary. So I came from a province that we have lots of money. But do you think is that part of the research reality, or the part of the lack of responsibility in decarbonization? Because there is a lots of lack of not to doing it, even though we have lots of resources in province like Alberta.
Is your question to anyone in particular? Everyone.
Do you want?
So it's a resource-rich area, and what are the responsibilities that come with that?
Do you want to go?
I actually, sorry, I didn't hear which province?
Calgary, was it? Alberta.
Alberta. So your question was on that you have a lot of resources, but, sorry, please repeat the question.
We have lots of resources, but what I felt is lack of responsibility not to invest on decarbonization. Seeing only profit maximization through, yeah.
So how to change that incentive?
And I, as a political scientist, would probably answer, this is a matter of political choice and political leaderships to make collective decision-making, to choose the very deliberately a bold vision to decarbonize. And that is possible. That has been showed. So I think I'm coming back to the domestic politics and the electoral system, and also, and we have many researchers here. I know Lisa Delmotte, if she's here. The importance of political elite communication, that political leaders to citizens communicate those bold visions and hard choices toward decarbonization. So I would say it's about politics.
We have one more right here. If you can get the microphone. If you can stand up so they know where they're going. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much for that interesting discussion. My name is Eira Bergman. I work for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, so I work on supply chains for transition minerals. And my question is relating to something you said, Andrea, but anyone who wants to weigh in is welcome. I'm really happy that you brought up this tension that exists around value addition in supply chains for transition minerals. And it's something that I've been researching in my work, so I was interested to hear your opinion on these international partnerships that the EU has been making with a large group of resource-rich countries. Because I've noticed that the EU tends to make a point about its support for local value addition, but of course, as you mentioned, it's in the EU's interest to also have value addition at home. So I'm interested to hear how you think that might be playing out. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can, or should I? Yeah. So when I read the Critical Raw Material Act by the EU, I can see that there is a tension between these different dimensions. And a lot of the goals that they have and formulate are not compatible with having these. But at the same time, so what I think is that they have written this policy proposal very much from an EU perspective, and then figured out that this doesn't really look that good. And then the sustainability perspective has been added on to it. So if you just skim through it, it might look like a nice policy coherence. But if you go a bit more further down to the content, it's not. Yeah. So, but I think that the EU has quite a lot that it can. I mean, I see it as that it could be a lever for development in these countries. I see when I look on like the business news from some of these developing countries, that sometimes the Chinese investments that are going on are framed as something beneficial, you know, and that EU has its colonial legacy, which makes it difficult. But it might sound a bit unhumble from a white European, but I actually think that having these Chinese investment might not be that good compared to having European investment. So I think that there is something that the EU can do to prove that it could actually be something beneficial for these countries too. And having it in a more way where you collaborate with the local communities and having profit sharing with them in another way than what has been done historically. Because there is, of course, a legacy which isn't something that one is proud of.
Can I just add on to this? But exactly, but when you talk to real-life diplomats from other countries, they also say, okay, we would, especially on like a working level, we would like to argue for cooperation with the EU as opposed to with China, but sometimes in terms of numbers and rules and regulations and all the like hoops we need to jump through, it's very difficult to bring it up and like to make it believable, especially on a higher level. So this is something that EU can tackle, I think.
Great, thank you, Andre, Daria, Karin. Thank you so much for joining us on stage. Karin, thank you so much.